this demo, we are going to create a soundscape, a sound design using FMOD. Separately, I'm going to show you the video how I generated these assets inside of Pro Tools, how to create some of these loops, and some basic editing. But first, let's take a look inside of FMOD. We have your events tab here on the top. This is where we create our event that will be triggered or emitted inside of Unity. We have the banks as the second tab. The bank section is essential when we are linking the sounds up inside of your game engine, and that's what's going to be exported out. And your assets, this is where we bring in your sound assets we created for your sound design or your sound in game. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that we have something inside of your sound assets so we can start working. This is my audio bin, and I pressed Command 3 on a Mac to bring this up. And we need to import audio files here into our audio bin. A shortcut for this is Command Shift and I. That brings you up the browser window where I can select the files and pull them in. Alternatively, we can also directly go and drag files in here. I've already created my folders organized based on the material. I'm actually going to go and select all of these folders and drag them into my audio bin here. The folders here, and you can see on the side we have the assets of sort of one-shots of birds here. When I select them, I can listen to them. Right. I have several different kinds of birds here. I have flies, just short clips of flies or one-shots of this. We have a Footstep folder. I have an ambience folder here, which we'll use to create our general bed. Next, we're going to bring this into an event inside of FMOD. But first, let's take a quick look what you have available to us here, because you might want to test out your loops, etc. And you can see here, when I click on one of these audio assets here, on the bottom you get the waveform, and I can select to play and also loop to make sure that we have a perfect loop that's going to be playing throughout. So we have our audio assets here. Now I'm going to go into my event folder, and if I right click in this region, in this area, I can see you have new events. This might also be called new default, I think, or default events. And I'm going to create a 3D timeline. And if I just create a 3D timeline, I get this. This is where it starts to look a lot like a digital audio workstation. You basically have a track. You have a master track here with your spatialization. And inside of my track here, we need to start creating what's called instruments. And instruments are what the clip container will have. It's referred to as a playlist. So think about inside of your digital audio workstation, you would bring in your audio clips, or in this case, audio assets. And as a single instrument, if I click on this, here's what we have created, a single instrument. And down here, we'll see that you need to drop audio files here. So basically, you need to have something inside here for it to play. And that's what I could take. For example, an ambient bed here and drag it in. And then I have, inside this instrument now, a playable event. Right? But right now, it just kind of plays. In this case, we're actually at bars and beats up here. We are not really dealing with music in this project. So we're going to hit time. So you see, it's just playing 1 second of this instance and stops. So that's not really what we want to do. We want to have more of a interactive loop here. So if I click here on the loop instrument, that's enabled. On the side here, you can actually select how many times it loops through. In this case, it's infinite, but you could select up to 20 different loops. So it loops through 20 times. And I'm going to select the trigger asynchronously. So if I select this, what we get is following. Right? So it's continuing to play, as you can see up there. It doesn't confine itself to what was kind of your timeline here. it continues to play regardless of what the timeline, or where the playhead is on this timeline. So if I take asynchronous off and I play it, it's sort of going to stop. It loops, but it stops and goes back to the beginning, not creating a very smooth loop. So when you've set asynchronous here, you've taken this off of the timeline. It continues to play. So that's how you could set up a basic loop. And I can drag this out as well. It's sort of detached from that, but it's still based on an event here. Timeline would continuously keep going. Everything that we do in FMOD, we want to sync up with the game engine. So you basically have to set up certain conditions. That's the flexibility of a game audio middleware such as FMOD. When we set up conditions, we want to start to plan out what these are. I basically want to build a forest ambience here, a forest ambience for a project. And I want to be able to feel like I'm moving through this forest and there are different things happening. So it's not the same loop being played throughout, that it varies, or it could change throughout distance, because a character could potentially be in one specific area for a longer time, and as they move across there, some things will happen, some things will trigger. And this is where I have my birds, flies, frogs, and stream, and also these one-shots here. So before I really move on here, instead of having a timeline or an event based on a time frame, I want to have a distance. So here where I have new events, I instead want to just create a parameter sheet here. So where it says timeline, this I'm going to get rid of eventually, but I'm going to select a parameter sheet. We're going to create a new parameter. We're going to call this forest. This is going to be a continuous parameter. You also have discrete and labeled parameters, and labeled parameters we're going to use when we use footsteps. Right? I'm going to do a continuous forest parameter from 0 to 100, and our initial value is our start value. You can set that at 0, or say, for example, you're in a middle point somewhere. You could start at 50 and then move whatever direction you want to. But just imagine that this is a distance parameter as we move around. We've now set up one event here that is the first forest bed. It's in a loop mode and it's continuous. Basically, it never stops. The play count is set to infinity. So I can move around my what I call forest depth here. Right now it's just set up to play this one track or play this one audio asset, and nothing much happened. So I need to start to build things within my forest bed. So this is my first bed. I'm going to do a couple of beds that can change as we move along. So if I want to create a new loop in this section here, I'm going to right click on the track. I'm going to add an audio track. You can also add, and that's Command T on a Mac. You can create an audio track, Command T. So here's my second audio track here, and it's going to be forest, and it's going to be bed, and it's going to be low. And now we are going to import a new forest ambience, and I have this, I believe. This is okay. I have this second forest ambience here. Okay, I want to be able to loop this for as long as this goes. I'm going to pull that up a little bit longer. So I want to feel like there's a slight change if I'm moving in my environment. So remember, the parameter set is the depth, the distance into as I walk through my forest soundscape in the game design here. So right now I'm just playing the forest ambience 1. And if I change my depth parameter here, so it's now playing both of these. So far we dealt with single instruments here. Single instruments. In single instruments, play that one instance on of that specific track inside of my event, and it could be looped. In this case, it's a looped event. We now want to create some variation inside of this environment. When you're in the forest or in specific sound environments, you notice there are specific sound triggers and instances that happened at randomized intervals. So one easy way in FMOD to create this, you have a multi-instrument, which we're going to look at when we actually go into our footsteps. But in this case, we actually have something called a scatterer instrument. And this allows us to import several sound asset sources that are triggered, but not only triggered, they can trigger multiple instances of this, and they can be spread out and randomized. So let me show you what this could be. For example, in our case, we're going to add birds. So if you look here in what's called a playlist, I'm going to add my birds. So I have birds. Let me see here. What are these birds? So I have a range of birds here. So I drag them in. And now you see here my scatter instrument. Each playlist here with an audio file, if I select it, you can listen to the clip here. So all the birds are different clips and samples here. We want to be able to trigger them in our game and make it feel natural in some way. So that's where we have a minimum and maximum spawn interval, and we have a minimum maximum distance. So the distance will feel like they're further away or closer. We also have volume randomization here, and we have pitch randomization. So we might want to adjust that the pitch of the birds is randomized. Of course, we don't want to go ridiculous. It'll sound something like this then. This is at max, which is 2 octaves. Some of them are really fast, really low in pitch. You might be able to create something unnatural, feeling from out of this world. In this case, that was a little bit too extreme. There was some distance there between the minimum and maximum. I can adjust that a little bit. I feel like it needs to be a little bit further apart, so I can adjust this minimum and maximum interval. So let's take a listen now and see if this changes anything. You can see when the samples are being triggered by looking at the green lit up here. You kind of hear that there's some distance in here. Without the background loop or ambience, it does feel a little bit like a sampler being triggered. So if I bring in or bring back my forest ambience bed 1 and 2, it feels a little bit more natural. I'm going to set the playlist to randomize. So we randomize the clip. Another important point here is we do have on the side play percentage. It means how frequently will this be played. For example, if you had a sample that really sticks out that you don't want to be played as often, these are pretty similar, but say for example I wanted this one to be played more or less, I can right click and set play percentage. You see that if I put this at 5%, the others were spread out at 14%. Now that specific instance will play less. In the next section, when we look at how we can add effects, I'm going to show you what we can do to add a different feeling of a depth in this bird samples. I'm going to also spread out. So see the length here of my distance, this clip will be playing as long, or this instrument will be playing as long as it's within my forest depth parameter here. So if it goes over 40, it will no longer be playing, kind of like a normal track feel or clip feel in a timeline in your digital audio workstation. So now it's only playing this second forest bed here. If you right click on the track here, on the event really, I'm going to press birds 01. This is a lighter bird sample. I'm going to add a separate bird sample here as we kind of go in a forest. We're going to do Command T. We're going to do birds 2. And at this point, we know it's easy to just create a scatter instrument like this. You could also drag them in, but usually it default to a multi-track instrument. I don't want that. The difference is a multi-track instrument, which I've created here, also has a randomized playlist, etc. But it has to complete each sample here. So if I hit play, it only plays one at a time, and do random. So if it feels more like it's just being triggered, so if I instead created a scatter instrument, in a scatterer, you have more parameters to work with to add some flexibility. In this instance, I'm going to make the scatter instrument have these separate bird sounds, and there is one bird sound that really I wanted to put these two. It's F, and let me pull this up actually. Where are they? Is it B and C? These are, I'm going to set the play percentage as less, so we hear this less. Let me put this at 4%. Same thing with this one. So we hear these bird sounds less. The other thing I wanted to do for this specific instance here, if I select the track itself, not the instrument. So here's where I'm going to set the spawn interval, the distance, and the randomization and whatnot. I'm going to add a reverb to this. So in this case, I'm going to add a FMOD reverb. So FMOD comes with a whole bunch of different plugins. I actually can also set, so if I listen to this, you hear this, it feels a little more lively. I have a reverb set here. You can of course get extreme with the reverb time. That's a little bit too much. I'm going to set this right in the middle here, about 3 seconds. So it feels like they're further away in the forest, right? I can adjust this reverb time here by right-clicking on the reverb time and add automation. If I add automation on this, when we get closer in, we can actually set a new reverb time. So maybe we start here in the top. It feels like it's further in distance, and as we get closer in this area, it starts to be less reverb. So it sounds like this. Okay, so I've set up 2 scatter instruments I've set up my forest beds. Now I want to start to build it out a little bit, add some other elements to this instrument. We're also going to add a different area where we're leaving one area and go closer to a waterfall or a water stream. I've now added tracks with additional scatter instruments. I've also added something here you can see. It's a nested event. So basically you see this yellow outline of this event, and that's actually an event from outside here called stream. So in the stream I've used the same parameter set for forest depth that we had created previously, and I've added this section here where you hear a forest stream of water. These are one single instruments that it's in a loop state, so it's going to loop throughout. And you might have noticed here too, I can, on the individual event or the clips of the assets, I can actually create a fade in here. So if I set the playhead here, it's a lot lower. So in this case, I didn't have to use the automation. You can, but as you're moving down a parameter, which is a depth, you will hear more of this forest stream. I've also added another layer here, which is a closer recording of this forest. And when I enter that area, you could hear this closer here. And you see also that there is a time delay as I place my playback head, this white line on the timeline. That parameter is set actually, well, that function is set in the parameter depth here. It's called seek speed. So there's a time when it will actually align itself going back and forth, just for testing at this point. I also have a stream close-up, which is a stronger water sound like this. So altogether you get this. And as I get closer, feels like you're right next to this stream or water. The one thing that I want to adjust here on the track itself here, taking some of that high-end crackliness out, I can do a lot of this work inside of my digital audio workstation, but sometimes you kind of notice things inside of your game audio middleware, and this is where I can use some of these effects. So if I click on the track itself, stream close, I can add this as a pre-fader effect, and I have a 3-band EQ. I can soften this up a little bit. So when I play it, it's not as aggressive sounding. So that's what I added there. Also, I've added another nested event, which is called frogs here. So when I get closer into my water or stream, I have 2 scattered instruments that are frogs. This is the first one. Okay. So what you notice here is I have all these recordings of frogs. I've set a minimum and maximum interval here. This is how often it gets triggered. And additionally, I have added, not only can you automate my volume for this, but you can also automate your EQ parameters and other parameters as well. So I've automated the 3-band EQ for low, mid, and high. So when we get close to the stream, you get full range of the frequencies, and I carved out the high and the mids as you're further away. I've added a reverb to this, so let's just kind of take a listen to that. But you can hear the reflections of this, of the reverb, especially there. So in this case, it's subtle, but there you can hear it sort of sounds like the frogs are echoing out in my imaginary forest. So I've adjusted the reverb time by right-clicking on this and add automation on the reverb time. And also I have adjusted my wet level. That's the amount of reverb level. So when I get closer to my stream, I don't have that expansive kind of reverb. It feels like they're closer by as you get closer to these frogs. There's still kind of some in the distance. There are some right next to you. So this will add some dimension to my frogs. And as you get closer, I'm taking a lot of these wet level off. And together, there's another type of frog here that has a similar kind of set. I'm adjusting the volume automation here. So together with the stream, you'll get a pretty lively environment. Both of these sound events are placed inside of my forest soundscape with crows, with two kinds of birds. I also have this wind instance as a parameter. So if I solo right here, I'm in a different part of the forest at this point. I have a scatter instrument that are little wind gusts that kind of come and go. These winds also have a reverb on it, but I'm not automating these. These are kind of just to fill out the space a little bit. Okay. And the last thing I want to add now to this is an event for flies. I'm going to create a new track and call this flies. And remember, I can right click here and say add scatter event. And these flies are going to be sort of from the middle points out, going to be heard. There are some flies, mind you, inside of my loops, but these are flies that are much closer. There are actually two sets of them. So we're going to do, the first is here. Kind of pesky little things. I might want to put these flies more prominent as you're entering the stream. And I'm actually going to add some flies in the beginning. Maybe I'll have these overlap. Call these flies too. Again, you could have done this as a nested event, but it's a little easier to see. Let me add a scatter instrument from the top here and just add two kind of flies that overlap. Let's see how these sound. I can't remember. Put them in my playlist. Ooh. I might actually flip these around, have these overlap a little bit, and I'm actually using the fade in and out parameters directly from on the instrument here itself. And this is the point where you create your sound design, you create the elements that you feel are right for your specific sound design project. You can adjust the amount of flies that you hear. You can start to figure out exactly what fly sample works and what not. So here are the events we created. We have nested events for the stream and for the frog. So the frog events with scatter instrument. As we get closer, we hear them closer. And the way we want to test this now, so sort of get an idea what this would feel like or sound like in a game, is we can open this Sandbox window, Sandbox view here. You have the scene. Instead of having event and bank and your audio assets, we have scenes here. So we're actually going to create a new scene so we can test this. We create a new scene and we call this Forest Scene 1. We basically just have an empty canvas right now with some transport controls here. Then we go into the event, and here's where we can actually drop in these events into our scene. So we're going to pull this forest background here, and that plays our forest. You see here we also have our forest depth here, and I can sort of listen to it. I'm going to fix those birds a little bit. They're a little bit, they feel like they just turned on and off, so I'm going to fix that a little cleaner. And now I can move my parameters and check to see how they operate. Should hopefully get a feel for the different events that we created, a different scatter instrument. And so now we're in a different area. The forest, this is where we have a little bit of wind gusts coming through. Crows are starting to be present here in this area. Starting to hear the different flies. The other event that I now want to create here for my testing is to show you how you can do a labeled event. And we're going to use that to set different materials for footsteps. So we're going to do a new event, 3D timeline. I'm going to call this Footsteps. And inside of each event, we're going to create a new parameter sheet here, which is called Footsteps. And instead of continuous, we're going to do a labeled footstep. Let's go and set dirt. Let's think we have mud. And then the last one I can't recall, maybe earth. So we have 3 labels, and we're going to call this parameter footsteps. When we have this 3 parameters, you're going to set the initial parameter here. So that's what it's going to default to. Inside of each container here for dirt, I'm going to create a multi-instrument instead of a scatterer. So scatterer could potentially trigger multiple footsteps when you want to feel like it's just one person walking. This is why this is an ideal container for that. We're going to drag these in to your multi-instrument. And here now my multi-instrument instance of dirt. Let's move this to earth actually. Dirt I think has its own here. I may actually create 3 separate tracks because I think I need to EQ the second set of footsteps. So this is dirt. Command T again creates a new one. This is earth and mud. So I can pull this down here. So this here is dirt. They're right now in a shuffle mode. I want to randomize this. And the one thing I can do to get this to be a little bit more varied is to, in this pitch control here, I can randomize automation for my pitch. I can set this at a level that's reasonable. Of course, this is way too much, because basically it changes the speed. So you do somewhere around 2 or 3, something like that. Okay. Same thing for randomized volume, so it feels like it has some variation on there. We are going to look at earth, and in this one we are also going to randomize this, and we're going to randomize the pitch randomize the volume. But here, I want to EQ this track. That's why I selected its own, so EQ this track. And here we can do, and let's adjust this to, so the footstep value now is under earth. So you see in the parameter here, it's changed to earth. So when I play it, it plays that with an EQ attached to it. And the last one was mud. Call this mud. And we are going to drag these clips into my mud. And here's my mud container. So let's put that to mud. And here on the mud, I'm going to also add an EQ to get some of that sort of clicky sound out. So now we have 3 different types of footsteps that my game engine can access by a specific material. In this case, it's a labeled value of dirt, earth, or mud. So when I go into now my sandbox here, and as you can see, my playback for dirt is spatialized, so as I move around you can hear that footsteps are moving around. And if I'm, for example, in a different area of the forest here, let's adjust the dirt to earth. And finally, let's go to testing this part of the forest, which is mud. So using the sandbox, you can test what the sounds feel like in a game situation. We can also link this up if we have this linked up with Unity. But in this case, we've just tested our sound design and we're now ready to start to think about implementing this into our Unity game. I hope this was helpful. Thank you.